This talk is about, we're going to go through what's new in Grails 3. I imagine most folks in here are familiar with Grails 2. Is that the case? Yeah? We, Grails 2 users. Has anybody actually tried Grails 3 yet, or is using Grails 3 in production? No, not yet. Okay. So that was my expectation. And hopefully, after this presentation, you will have enough material that you will be convinced that it's now is the moment to give it a go with Grails 3 and try it out in some of new applications and potentially migrate some of your existing applications. Who am I? My name is Graeme Rocher. I'm from Object Computing. We are a full-service support organization that provides consulting, training, and support. And if you have trouble, for example, upgrading your apps to Grails 3 and you need that assistance from us, then we can provide that. We're committed to the future of Grails in the long term. And we're also going on a massive hiring spree. So if you think you're a hotshot Grails programmer and want to do some exciting work, come speak to us. Our booth is out there in the exhibitor hall, and we can connect you with the right people to make that happen, because the Grails team is growing at OCI, and we're pretty excited about the future. You also at the OCI table outside in the exhibition hall, you can meet the Grails team, myself. I'll be there a large part of the day, I imagine, and folks like Jeff Brown and Colin Harrington, who are all part of the Grails team at OCI. So come around and have a chat. But anyway, let's get on to the serious business of Grails 3 and where we are. So Grails 3 is now at 3.0.7. We have been doing more frequent releases, hence we have arrived to the 3.0.7 faster than in previous generations of the framework, you can imagine. And we are already, on Monday, we released Grails 3.1 milestone 1, which I'll be covering a bit as well. The Grails 2.x branch of Grails is in maintenance mode, in that we will continue to put out 2.5.x releases, fixing critical bugs and problems that arise. And we plan to continue maintaining Grails 2.x in the near term, whilst folks are still migrating their applications to Grails 3. And another thing I encourage you to do is we have a Slack channel now on Grails. Has anybody used Slack before? Yeah. So it's a bit like IRC, but without all the complicated, it's not scary like IRC. So you just click on a link, sign up, and there's various chat channels where folks get together, talk about Grails stuff. We have a developer channel where you can engage with myself and Jeff Brown and all the good folks at OCI and the rest of the community. We have 800 members already. Normally there's about 100 people online at any one time talking about Grails stuff. So it's a great way to connect with the community. And I encourage you to check it out. So let's talk about what's new in Grails 3 then. So Grails 3, we have a complete rewrite of our build system. So in Grails 2.x, we had a custom build system that's now been replaced by Gradle. We've rebased Grails on top of Spring Boot. So if you are tempted by all of the Spring Boot, great Spring Boot features like integration with Spring Cloud and the auto configurators and those great features of Spring Boot, don't fear, are not missing out by using Grails. You get all those features just the same because the Grails 3 app is also a Spring Boot app, so that you can use all those great things that were talked about at the keynote last night, and tonight in the keynote tonight I'll be demonstrating some of that and how it works all really nicely with Grails 3. We also introduced application profiles, which I'll talk about a bit more, which is essentially different development environments or targeted at building different kinds of applications. I'll go into that in more detail. There's extensive support for Groovy traits. We have a new code generation API for all of the code generation part of Grails, application events, and a whole bunch of additional stuff. Probably too much to cover in a talk this long. That's why I have another talk tomorrow, which will go even deeper. So if you feel this talk only brushed the surface, then come to my talk tomorrow and we'll go more deep dive. But anyway, let's start with Gradle. So in the Grails 2.x build system has been removed and replaced with a suite of Gradle plugins. And you have complete access to the Gradle plugin ecosystem. So what that means is, although folks may be concerned about certain plugins not being there anymore, for example, folks have come up to me and said, "Oh my God, there's no code coverage plugin for Grails 3. What are we going to do?" Well, don't panic. There's a Gradle plugin. Yeah. So you have the complete access to all of the Gradle ecosystem. So you can use, I think there's about 3 different code coverage plugins for Gradle. One based on Corbatura, another one based on Jacoco, I think it's called. And there's a Clover plugin for Gradle. So there's a whole bunch of choices that you can just plug into your Gradle build and use it. And the same for things like Find Bugs and CodeNarc and all those build-related plugins from Grails 2 that are not available in the plugin repository for Grails 3 at the moment initially. That's just because there's not going to be replacements for them because there are already existing replacements in the Gradle community for those features. Yeah, so that's a good thing because we can lean on Gradle where really all the innovation is happening in the build space on the JVM right now is happening in the Gradle community. So it's powerful and flexible. And you really have a lot more choice and robustness with Gradle being behind Grails 3. So that one of the things that meant is we have a clear delineation in Grails 3 between what plugins can contribute to and how they contribute. So before, a Grails plugin could essentially contribute end-to-end right from code gen to the build, to the runtime, and they're all bundled up in one thing. And whilst convenient, it created issues in terms of build-related artifacts ending up in the runtime and so forth. So now we have a clear delineation where a plugin can do code gen. They can do completely separately, though, be a Gradle plugin, and completely separately to that, they can also contribute to the runtime. So any one plugin can't necessarily do all 3 of those things, but you may create a multi-project build in Gradle that provides all of those things at different points into a Grails 3 application. So why Gradle? As I mentioned earlier in the Pancake podcast this morning, for those of you who are aware, we're moving to a world where you want to compose your application from smaller modules and that are smart. We're going to use the trend term micro in size, and using Gradle and its multi-project build support really allows that to be done a lot more gracefully. We can lean on Gradle support for multi-project builds. You can run individual sub-projects. You can package them all up into a single monolithic application if you want to, or you can run them each individually and compose your application. And as you, for example, move towards more cloud-based infrastructure where you have multiple Grails applications implementing your various microservices, you want a powerful build tool to be able to orchestrate that and build that and deploy that. And that's where Gradle comes in. So let's try and go ahead and do a demo of Grails. So I'm using Grails 3.1 M1, latest and greatest. But 3.0.7, the same applies there. And in terms of what I'm going to demonstrate, there's nothing 3.1 specific here. The same is happening in 3.0.x. So just like in previous versions of Grails, and actually before I create an app, I want to run the list profiles command, because that's a new command that maybe you're not familiar with from Grails 2. And you can see that we got different profiles targeted at different types of applications. So even a plugin for Grails is now a profile. And you can see we got the web profile, which is the default profile, the web API profile. Anyway, I'll be discussing more about profiles shortly. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an app called demo, which is just going to create a default web profile application, cd into that. And you'll notice immediately that if we open up my demo application here, just going to get rid of some of these windows, we have a build.gradle file. Yeah. So a Grails 3 project is a Gradle project as well. There are Gradle W. So if you were used to Grails W, we're still considering adding a Grails W. It's a consideration for addition back to Grails 3. But for most folks, the Gradle W will work just fine. For those of you who don't know what that is, it means that you can deploy your application or upload your application to any continuous integration server or anything and just do Gradle W assemble, for example, and it will run Gradle, download the latest version of Gradle locally, so you don't need to worry about configuring Gradle for that build machine or anything like that. So the cool thing is I'm just building a WAR file here. You can see it's gone ahead and compiled my classes, processed the resources, compiled the Groovy, done some asset compilation. We have asset pipeline integration. Compiled my GSP pages. You can see with the compile Groovy task in there. And the powerful thing about Gradle is if we run that again, Gradle has really great support for incremental build, and Grails integrates nicely with that. So if I run the same assemble task again, and this is something that wasn't present in Grails 2.x, the build system there, you can see the compile Groovy is up to date. It's no point in running the tests again. There's no point in running asset compile again because you just ran it. So you got built-in integration. There's no point in compiling the Groovy pages again because they're up to date. Nothing's changed. You built-in integration with Gradle's incremental compilation, which improves your build performance. Yeah. So that's great. The other thing you'll probably be familiar with from Grails 2 is that there's an interactive mode. Just like in Grails 2, if you type the Grails command, you get dropped into an interactive console with tab completion for your various commands and so forth. And if you run, for example, compile here, you'll notice that will actually call out to Gradle. So interactive mode integrates nicely with Gradle so that you can run normal Gradle commands. And there's actually a Gradle completion as well. So if I do Gradle and then I can run essentially any Gradle command, for example, Gradle compile Groovy is essentially the same as compile. There you go. So I can run any Gradle command from this interactive console as well. You also get full access to all the code generation features, the same as in Grails 2. So you got your create controller, your create domain class, or your create commands. We can list all of the available plugins that are in the plugin repository for Grails 3. And we can install our application into our local Maven cache. Schema export is there. We can run a dependency report to see our dependencies, just like in Grails 2. We can see a complete dependency graph of our application dependencies. And all of those commands that you're familiar with from Grails 2 are still there. Run app, stats, loading up the Groovy console. It should be a very familiar experience if you're used to Grails 2 in terms of the way Grails integrates with Gradle. The main difference being that it's the Gradle build system in the back, and instead of Grails plugins for the build, you've got Gradle plugins. So once you get familiar with that, it's nice and elegantly integrated, the two frameworks. Okay, so the other important thing about Grails 3 is that it's built on top of Spring Boot. So again, that allowed us to focus our efforts on key areas of Grails where we can provide benefit over and above Spring Boot. So whilst Boot handles embedded servers, runnable jars, packaging WAR files through the Spring Boot Gradle plugin, external configuration integrated with Spring Cloud, that's all handled by Spring Boot. Grails, on the other hand, can focus on providing the conventions, controllers, plugins, and all of the Grails features, GORM, all of the Grails GSP, all the Grails features that you're used to. Instead of having previously in Grails 2, we had a Tomcat plugin. In Grails 3, that's no longer necessary because Spring Boot provides the Tomcat integration. And you can switch out, you'll notice this, in fact, if we look at our build.gradle here, we're using the Spring Boot Tomcat starter dependency to start up Tomcat. You can swap this out for Jetty or I think Undertow as well, and swap out containers just by modifying your dependency. So that when you do Grails, so that when you do run app, it'll use Jetty instead. Or when you use, so there's no need for us to maintain a Jetty plugin and a Tomcat plugin because that's all handled by Spring Boot. The other thing that Spring Boot provides is it handles FATJAR and embedding. For example, if we look at my build.gradle again, you'll notice that up here I'm implying the WAR plugin. I could equally remove that completely, and it'll create a jar instead. And even the WAR file itself is runnable. So for example, if I'd run the WAR command here to create my WAR file, so I'm going to create my WAR file, and then if I cd into my build directory to find the WAR file that was created, if I do java/jar demo WAR, it'll run my application. My application is essentially a runnable WAR file. Yeah. So you have containerless deployment. If you want to just, which integrates great with things like Docker. So if you want to run your Grails apps in Docker containers, you can just tell your Docker container to run your application main class and start up your Grails application directly from the WAR, rather than thinking about, oh, I have to deploy this WAR file to a Tomcat container, or there's actually no need to deploy. But of course, if you have a Tomcat container or JBoss or whatever, you can still take your WAR file and drop it in there, and everything operates the same. Yeah, so it just gives you more flexibility on how you deploy your Grails application. And in a microservice as well, it's often the case that you want to deploy your multiple microservices in Docker containers, for example, or even if you're not using Docker, you want to just run them as java.mains and java.jar and tweak them like that. So you have complete flexibility in terms of deployment, whether you're deploying to a traditional container or managing the deployment yourself. Okay. So yeah, Grails 3 apps can also take advantages of any boot auto configuration or anything like that, and Spring Cloud. So I'm going to do a quick demo, and in this case, I'm going to import my application into an IDE, in this case, IntelliJ. So we get this IDE going. Click Import. So I'm using IntelliJ 14.1 Community Edition right now. IntelliJ 15 is going to have more comprehensive Grails 3 support. But right now, IntelliJ 14.1 is actually perfectly usable just by using the Gradle tooling. So all I did was to create a new project from existing sources and pointed it to my build.gradle, imported the project, and automatically my class paths and everything is set up correctly. Yeah. One of the things that, in terms of being built on Spring Boot, is a Grails 3 application has an application class. You'll see here it is. So this is my application class, and you can see that it's got a static void main. Yeah. So you know, a lot of folks, when you want to run your application, they come in here and you do run app. But actually, you can just as easily, from your IDE, I can just as easily go right-click or and just click run, and my application will run directly from my IDE. Yeah. So if I come in here and go to my localhost, there it is, my application running directly in my IDE. This has tangible benefits because essentially, if I want to debug my application, for example, I can just save this configuration up here, and instead of running the application, we can just debug, and I'm debugging my application. Yeah, so there's no reason to come out here to the console separately, run app with the debug, and then attach a remote debugger or anything like that. You can run and debug your application directly from your project. Yeah, it is just a static void main. The only thing to remember is by default, when you run your application in this way, reloading doesn't work unless you come into your edit and edit your configuration and disable the verifier. Because in order for reloading to work, runtime reloading to work, you have to disable the verifier because it gets in the way of the reloading agent. So if I add that configuration setting, and I think in IntelliJ 15 they will actually do that automatically for you, so you won't have to think about that. But now if I run my application, I get reloading as well, even when running from my IDE. So all my classes reload, all my changes reload, changes to everything reload inside my IDE without issues. And we can verify that by refreshing here. You can see now reloading active is true. Yeah, so reloading is active. So any change to my application will be reloaded. Okay. Yeah, this application class is essentially equivalent to your Spring Boot. In Spring Boot, you often see like an application class that has enable WebMVC on it or something like that. That is not necessary with Grails, but of course, if you're using something like Spring Cloud or any of the auto configuration classes available to Spring Boot, you can type things like enable annotation from Spring Boot can be enable caching or enable reactor or enable scheduling. All those enable annotations can be added to your application class, and it'll work with Grails. Yeah. So there's no any part of Spring Boot can be used within your Grails 3 application without any problems. So that provides the best of both worlds. You get the convention, the code generation, controllers, GORM, GSP, all of the plugin ecosystem of Grails, combined with what's available to you by Spring Boot. The best of both worlds. Okay. So a little bit about that application class. It's found in a new directory that it didn't exist in Grails 2 called grailsapp/init. You've got a static void main, so you can just run it from your IDE. It implements the Grails application lifecycle interface. So that's actually quite handy because inside your application class, you can override a whole bunch of methods that are potentially useful. For example, if you want to override, you can override on startup, for example, and that event will be fired whenever your application starts up. This method will be called. You can override on shutdown, same deal. If when your application shuts down, this will be called. You can override things like do with Spring. So just like a plugin, you can define additional Spring beans in here by returning a closure. So for example, I can define a bean called my foo bean or whatever, and it's a string, and the value is foo. I've defined a Spring bean that's injectable into all of my classes. Yeah. The application class is also a normal Spring component, so I can use also the @bean annotation and use Java configuration style as well to define beans. So your application class is actually something quite useful. I suggest you explore the API available to it. There's many things that can be done. It can provide some of the features that plugins provide, as well as hooks into the lifecycle of a Grails application. Okay. So another thing new in Grails 3 is configuration. We've rethought how we do configuration and base it a lot around the way that Spring Boot works integrated with the Spring Boot property sources model. So there is a new, inside the conf directory, there is a application.yaml file which defines our configuration. So this is the equivalent to config.groovy. And in fact, you can also have an application.groovy file if you prefer the old Groovy syntax. The reason we have YAML as the default is because YAML is both machine readable and writable. So if we have any code generation scripts that modify it automatically, we can read and write to the document without losing any context, which is not possible with config.groovy in Grails 2 or application.groovy. But if you have an application.yaml and an application.groovy, then they get merged into your configuration. So don't worry if you want to use both, or you can combine, mix and match however you want. But essentially, this application.yaml file becomes a property source for your application. And there are other property sources that your application inherits as well. So system properties are a property source. Environment variables are a property source. So for example, if you have a setting in here, for example, hibernate cache queries, and you want to for a particular environment disable the hibernate.cache.queries variable and set it to false, or set it to true, or vice versa. You can set a system property, pass it to the JVM saying hibernate.cache.queries, and it'll override the setting in here. Or you can set an environment variable at the operating system level called hibernate.cache.queries, true or false, and it will override what's in here. So you have these inheritable property sources that allow you to control local configuration for your application, but also override and inherit from property sources that are specific to the environment that you're running your application in. So you have full control over that, and which is pretty handy. And you also have an API for configuration. So we have defined a new config interface. So the configuration object in Grails is now an interface rather than just a normal map. And it has some useful methods that it inherits from the property resolver interface. For example, there is, you can just get a property by name, but you can also get a property by name and coerce it to a particular type. And you can also get a property by name and convert it to a particular type and specify a default value. So we have a full API rather than just doing config.foo.bar. You can actually you can ask the config for a particular type, and we have type conversion built in. So we have whilst before in Grails 2, the configuration was just a map that you could navigate, and we left it up to you. Now it's actually a formalized interface. It's still a map, so the old way still works, but if you are reading your configuration in your application, you now have a formalized API to read values and convert to specific types if you want, and default to a specific value if you want. So it's much more complete, the API. So as an example, if you get a reference to the config object, which is normally Grails application.config, or you can implement configuration aware in any of your beans. You get a reference to the config object, and you can call get property foo.bar, and that'll obviously look in your application.yaml for foo::bar::value. And if it's in this example here at the top, we're trying to look for a Boolean. So unless it has to be a Boolean, if it's not a Boolean, it'll return null. And the last argument is the default value. So if it returns null, then return true. So you have this API for configuration that's much more easily able to be controlled in terms of instead of saying if the property exists in the map, then set it to true. Otherwise, do this. You don't have to write logic in your application to parse default values or convert types or anything like that. That's all handled by Grails for you. The other thing it does is it integrates nicely with Spring. So in Spring, you have configuration injection. So there is an @value annotation that you can add to any of your Grails classes. So a controller or a service or your own beans that you register, you just write @value and the name of the configuration value, and it will use configuration injection to look up from your application.yaml or your system properties or your environment variable the exact value of foo.bar and inject that into your object, and that's all handled by Spring. So if you don't like the API-based approach, just use Spring @value, and that will achieve the same effect if you prefer the annotation-driven approach. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about application profiles then. Application profiles are essentially it's essentially a way to generate a particular kind of application targeted at developing a particular kind of for example, the default profiles for developing traditional web applications, the Grails that you've always known and loved, that's the default. But now we have like a whole bunch of other profiles and potentially a growing list in the future for creating more targeted applications. For example, the Web API profile in Grails 3.1 is specifically designed for developing API applications where you don't have a web front end in the Grails application. You may have a web front end. It could be an Angular app or something else. But it's the API that you expose to those front ends or native your native mobile applications, your iOS, your Android apps, and so on. We essentially have a community-maintained set of profiles and core profiles. In Grails 3.1, we're going to make this whole mechanism more extensible by the community, so you can define your own profile repositories that you might want to create a profile that's for your internal team. This is the so that when you do create app profile equals my company, it creates an application with your default backend services for your application and your internal build plugins for Gradle, and a whole formalized mechanism for formalizing the creation of new applications for your organization. Yeah, so in 3.1 we're making the whole mechanism extensible, so other companies can develop their own profiles and extend the existing ones with company-specific features or even open source specific features. So we anticipate many contributions in this area. So yeah, each profile has a distinct set of plugins. Potentially can customize runtime, packaging, everything. So the default profile repository is at that link. So if you want to see what a profile repository looks like, when you create an application in Grails 3, it'll check out that repository and use that as for the creation of the profiles. So that's where the web API profile is defined in the web profile. And in the future, when we have extensible profile repositories, there'll be the ability to define multiple potential repositories. That's what we refer to as a profile repository. Like I said at the beginning, when you do Grails list profiles, you can see the available profiles that are available to you. And in Grails 3.1, we're pretty excited about the web API profile, or the REST profile. We first introduced it in Grails 3.0.5, but it's been refined further in Grails 3.1 M1. It's targeted at building REST APIs. So the dependencies have been optimized to exclude everything that's not necessary and include only what you need to build those applications. So there's no GSP, there's no UI plugins, there's no asset pipeline. It's designed specifically for building pure REST applications. So let's have a look at that now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just stop the app. I'm just going to check that I don't have it running here. Yeah. Okay, we're going to close this app. And we're going to create a new one. So I'm going to create a new app called REST demo, and this is going to be the web API profile. CD REST demo. And then we can import this project into IntelliJ just like before by pointing to my build.gradle. Open it up. And if we start up interactive mode, you can see, we'll have a look what we have. So if I hit tab, you can immediately see that I have a different set of commands, yeah, for building this application than for the web profile. So I've got a create domain resource command, for example, over here, which is for creating an @resource domain class. I've got a create RESTful controller command. Even the existing commands such as create controller and generate controller have been overridden to do API-specific things. Yeah. If we run this app, we'll have a look what we got initially. So this was the home page of a normal web application developed with Grails. So if we now hit refresh and hit localhost, you can see that I've refreshed my page and we have a JSON view. Yeah. So obviously there's no GSPs in this app. So instead we have a JSON API. So we can see that my app profile is web API, the version of my app. We can see the available controllers in my application. There's an application controller, which we'll talk about that in a minute. The various versions, we've got a message, welcome to Grails, gives us information. So this is essentially a JSON view of that same page. And so how is this all working? Let's have a look. So first of all, we have an application controller, and this is what it looks like. It just returns a model with my Grails application and my plugin manager. And then we've got some views over here. So let's open these with the Groovy editor. There we go. So we have an index.jsp view and index.json, JSON. So instead of GSP views, you have JSON views. So in here we have a new view technology called JSON views, and you can define a model and the JSON that is going to be produced. We also have a not found JSON. So this is my JSON for what happens when something is not found. And if we look at my URL mappings, if something is not found, it's going to render the not found view. So if we try that, just go to blah, you can see I get not found back as JSON. So instead of getting an HTML page, which is not relevant to a web API project, we get a JSON response back. If we got a critical error exception thrown, we would get a server error response. Yeah. And if we look at our application class is exactly the same. But if we look at our set of plugins, you can see that we have a more focused set of plugins. We don't have all of the plugins. We just have URL mappings. We have REST. We have services. We have a data source, some data binding, some async handling, Hibernate. We have the Views JSON plugin. And it's completely focused for developing JSON APIs. So let's create a domain class. Class called book, for example. There it is. And we can have a title or whatever. And now let's run generate all and see what happens when we do that for our book domain class. There we go. We can see now that we have a book controller, and I imagine that's reflective in our let's see, book controller. Let's just stop this. We have a compilation error for some reason. Probably the order of reload events was reversed. So we have our book controller in there. And if we go to books index, you can see when we go to the index view, it just returns an empty JSON list. So how did that happen? In our book book/index action here, essentially it renders an index.json view. So instead, we've got a JSON view that looks at our iterable list of books and renders a book template for each one. So you've got an underscore book.json as well that defines how a book is rendered. So we have a to-do item in here to render the book properties. We can do that, for example, book.title. And now, obviously, we don't have any books at this stage. And then the other thing that would be useful in doing is defining a more useful URL mapping. So books to resources book. And now if we save that, yeah, now we got the correct, instead of book/index, we got books, which is more handy. Now if we attempt some curl fun, we can do a post to our books URL and send it some, but what we want to do actually is with the header content type application JSON, and we want to send some data, that's some JSON data. So let's do some title, stand, submit that. There we go. Now if we refresh, we got some books. If we look at the first one, the first book in the list is our stand. So we got a JSON API for rendering our books out of the box. Yeah, completely RESTful with not much effort. So that's the web API profile, yeah? So you got this focused experience for developing JSON web APIs, completely forgetting about HTML and JavaScript and all the web, traditional web stuff that's left for maybe your front-end team who's doing AngularJS, and they just back onto this super rapid development framework for developing web APIs. It's pretty cool stuff. So that's that. So that's a brief demo of Grails 3.1 and the REST profile. So as you can see, in the REST profile, you get profile-specific commands, like create domain resource that creates an @resource domain, create RESTful controller, and you have more focused templates. You got JSON views instead of GSP, and a whole bunch of neat stuff for helping you knock out those APIs quickly and efficiently with Grails. You got JSON and markup views. I didn't demonstrate the markup views, but you essentially have statically compiled extensible views. So one of the neat things about these JSON views is they catch errors and so forth. What is going on? It's not letting me leave. We've killed something. Die. Something's not happy. One moment, please. Okay, that's better. Something was completely blocking my processor. Safari. Okay, so yeah, one thing I didn't demonstrate was if you, that book.json template that was rendering my JSON view here, if I were to misspell, for example, the reference to the title property of book, and I save that, you will get a compilation error when rendering that output. So you see, I got an internal server error now, and you can see that the static type checking is telling you at the compilation time that property title for class is not valid. So you actually get compile time checking of these templates as well, which is pretty neat. And if I was to stop my application and then attempt to produce a war file or something to that extent, the JSON views are compiled by Gradle ahead of time, so that your permgen is not exhausted, and it integrates all nicely with Gradle compilation. And you see I got a compilation error saying, actually that view doesn't even compile, so it's not a valid view if I return that to a normal, correct spelling. The other benefit of being statically compiled is that the performance of these views is excellent. In terms of your view rendering performance for your API, you want them to be as fast as possible in terms of rendering views from the server. So super fast view rendering of your JSON views. Okay, stop the application. So that's JSON views. Another new feature in Grails 3 is interceptors. So in Grails 2, you may be familiar with filters and how those work. So we wanted to introduce a new mechanism to replace filters. And the reason for that is because we want to make as much of Grails as possible compatible with compile static and static compilation, which was introduced in more recent versions of Groovy. And because an interceptor is typically something that gets hit on every request, it's a very good candidate for static compilation, because an interceptor might match every single request into your application. So it's critical that you get the optimal performance out of those interceptors. And a great way to do that is via static compilation in Groovy, which it now supports. And the other thing is we wanted to rethink how the conventions worked. So now you can create interceptors that match by convention. So we had our book controller. So now if I do create interceptor, for example, it'll create a book interceptor. So if we look at my application in here, we got a book interceptor and a book controller. And by convention, book interceptor will match every action of book controller, yeah, just by convention. So we got the nice convention over configuration. If we want to override that, you can create a new constructor, and you can change how the matching works. So you can say instead match all except action login or something to that effect, yeah? So you can control how matching works, and essentially it's just a matter of implementing before, after, and after view. So we can easily add a compile static on here, and it'll compile statically and so forth. So interceptors are more traditional Groovy classes, whilst the old filters mechanism was defined through closures and so forth. If you want to control the order of a filter, you can, each interceptor implements the ordered interface, and you can just set an order, which is a number. If you enable debugging for interceptors, you can see how the order is calculated, and you can adjust your order. The default order is 0, so you just do 1 or minus 1 or minus 10 or 10 to adjust the orders so they're running exactly the order that you want to run. We encourage, if you're going to use this technique, as well as to use constants for the integers that you set in terms of the order. So a static constant, that's what we do in, for example, integration with Spring Boot as well. Spring Boot defines some constants for matching all filters after a particular, that match after wrapping a request. So, so it's a good thing to do, to use constants to define the order as well. So yeah, interceptors are pretty handy as well, and they all implement the intercepted trait. So traits are, again, something that I'll be talking about more in my talk tomorrow. I don't have time in this talk to cover every last aspect of Grails 3, but traits are a big part of Grails 3, and I'll be talking about that more in depth in my, my talk tomorrow. But in terms of interceptors, you can define them, you can override the matching using the match all method and configure matching. Jeff had an interesting idea as well about if you implement configuration aware in your interceptor, you can, which has a set configuration method. So that gets called when the interceptor is initialized, and you can read your matching strategy from your configuration by just using that strategy, which is pretty nice feature if you want to say in your config define a match condition inside your configuration. You just read it and then call match all, match only, you know. So you can it's completely customizable in terms of how matching works, which is nice, both at runtime and at startup time. The constructor is the handy place because these are singleton objects, interceptors. Only one of them is created per application. Again, for performance reasons, you want your interceptors to be as fast as possible. So a constructor is a handy place, but you can just as easily define the matching in an external object as well. So, or in a post-construct method, or wherever is convenient for you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. I brushed on traits, but let's talk a little bit about the evolution of metaprogramming and how that all works in Grails. So in Grails 1, we used in order to make Grails what it is, we used a lot of runtime metaprogramming. So where we modified the meta class, that was then subsequently replaced by compile time metaprogramming using AST transforms, and we went that way as we wanted to reduce the runtime overhead of metaprogramming, and also to make Grails more and more compatible with static compilation and IDEs. And now in Grails 3, a large number of our transforms have simply been replaced by traits. So some of the core traits in Grails, every single controller in a Grails application now implements the controller trait. So from an IDE perspective and from a code completion perspective, it's much easier for you to just open up the source code for the controller trait if you want to see what Grails is doing. Every single method in controllers is defined in the controller trait. So the render method, the respond method, the redirect method, they're all in there. You know, the methods that you've got used to using, they're all in there. There's no need to find the particular bit of metaprogramming or the particular AST transform that added that method, like you had to do in previous versions of Grails. It's now all formalized in a nice, elegant API. Same thing for GORM. All the methods of GORM are defined in the GORM entity trait. Traits allow you to define static methods, which is pretty cool. So, you know, even the dynamic finders is defined by the method missing, and all the list method, the get method from a GORM perspective are all in there inside the GORM entity trait. Services all implement the service trait. Tag libraries implement the tag library trait, and interceptors implement the interceptor trait. And we see this pattern going to be emerging a lot more in the future. We never wanted to use inheritance hierarchies in early versions of Grails to define integration with the framework, because it limits you to only extending from a particular superclass, but with traits and the way they can be composed and overridden, it provides the ultimate solution of being able to implement whatever superclass you want, but still implement the controller trait and compose multiple traits into one. So, for example, the tag library trait and the controller trait are actually relatively simple because they share a lot of logic. Both traits, both the controller and the tag library traits share logic to look up the request, the response, the output stream, a whole bunch of stuff that is common in terms of both of those. Both controllers and tag libraries can invoke tags, so they share a common tag library invoker trait. So we were able to compose our traits out of multiple traits. And in fact, you can even implement any of Grails' core traits. So if you want to create a class that is able to invoke tag libraries, you just implement the tag library invoker trait and add it as a bean. And suddenly you have a class that can call g.render and call a tag library, or you know, invoke any tag from your class. So it's pretty neat the way things are composed in terms of Grails 3 and traits, and it's a lot easier for you to understand the inner workings of the framework as well. And the other thing is how it's now possible to, and again, this is something I'll be covering a lot more in my talk tomorrow, how you can compose behavior and add additional behavior to classes in Grails 3 via traits. So there is a enhances annotation that you can add to any trait, and you can tell Grails that this trait enhances controllers by using @enhances controller. I put the constant string in there, but we have actual constants in the framework. You do controller artifact.type instead. It's just shorter for the slide. But you can say @enhances controller, and then you define your trait, and you can add, you could create whatever additional methods you want, and those get weaved into your controller. And the great thing is they get weaved in the way that is compile static compatible and IDE compatible. IntelliJ 15, which is coming out at the end of the year, is able to, I've already been playing with some of the snapshot builds, is able to detect all the traits on your class path and automatically provide code completion for plugins that use @enhances and traits. And it works with compile static. So if you add a compile static on a class that gets methods from one of these traits, you get the code completion, you get the static compilation, type checking, and it all just works. So it's much more powerful. So yeah, if I hadn't plugged that session enough, tomorrow 12:45, Grails 3.x inside and out. More detail on all of this stuff and traits and plugins and all of the good things in Grails 3 that I wasn't able to cover in this short, hour and a half talk. Will be covered in more detail in the next one. So some of the things that you should be aware of in terms of changes if you're considering upgrading. So there's no more Servlet 2.5 support. So if you deploy to a Servlet 2.5 container, you're out of luck. But I don't know how many of those are still around. That's pretty old now. So good riddance. But there is no web XML in Grails. Like in Grails 2, we generated a web XML file. And there used to be a way to, like in the source templates directory, there was a web.template.xml or something. You could modify it and whatever. There is no web.xml in Grails 3. It is gone. Yeah. So if you want a web.xml, I think there is still a way to define a base one, but it's not. I haven't really seen a case where it's needed anymore, and I'll explain some of the alternatives. Gantt and the current build system, well, the 2.x build system is gone. That means that if you relied on plugins that needed that build system, you'll need to use their Gradle equivalents. But in often cases, the Gradle equivalents are superior. So if you're using the code coverage plugin, as I mentioned before, you have 3 choices in the Gradle ecosystem that offer alternatives. If you're using find bugs, there's a Gradle find bugs plugin. If you're using CodeNog, there's a Gradle CodeNog plugin. So there are alternatives to that. Integration tests. So this is another thing, actually, and I think I'm going to do a brief demo of this, is that the functional testing in Grails 3 is quite different in that if I create a functional test, say for my book class, book controller, you'll see that, and that's actually one of the things that we're still working on updating, but we now use Jeb by default. So Jeb, all functional tests now extend Jeb spec, and you can use Jeb interactions to essentially encapsulate your logic. And these are runnable from your IDE. Yeah, so that's a big change from Grails 2 in that previously integration and functional tests, you had to use test app. And some IDEs provided integration with that. But these now are runnable from your IDE, and it's smart enough to only load up your container once. So if you run a whole suite of them from your IDE, it'll load up the container in memory once, run all your functional tests against that in-memory application, and then exit at the end of it. That means that you can run a whole set of functional tests, and it's a lot more performant. Yeah, and you'll see that there's the rollback annotation as well. So any changes that you make to your application in terms of your persistent data gets rolled back after each test by default. So we have, when I say that integration tests are gone, they're gone in their form that they were in 2.x. And we still have support for Hibernate test mixin and all the test mixins, and the way the unit testing works still works the same. So that's not a big deal to upgrade. Metaprogramming, it still works in Grails 3. You can still do it if you want. Nothing's been fundamentally changed there. But internally, it's been changed from the Grails perspective. So all of our internal stuff no longer uses expanded meta class or any of the previous metaprogramming APIs. It's all been replaced by traits and Groovy extensions. So if you're upgrading, we encourage you to consider looking at that approach. because it's better from a startup time perspective, a memory consumption perspective, a whole bunch of reasons why it's superior. And filters. So filters still work in Grails 3. There's still a filters plugin. It's not going to be developed any further. It's largely considered deprecated. You can still use it. I think in Grails 3.1, we are going to externalize it to a separate plugin available via the plugin portal. So if you're upgrading, you can still use your existing filters, and that's fine. But we encourage you to look at interceptors if you're doing an upgrade to an existing application and consider using them instead. Again, it'll help your memory consumption, it'll help your performance, and generally that's where the future development focus will be in terms of that part of the framework. So just one note regarding Servlet 3 and there being no WebXML. So, oh my goodness, we need to add a servlet. What do we do? Again, it's one of the areas we lean on Spring Boot. You just define a Spring Bean, and it gets registered in your servlet container and just works. Yeah. So there's also a filter registration bean and a servlet registration bean, which provides a little bit more flexibility about customizing how it matches and what URLs it matches and so on and so forth. You can use that as well. But essentially what I'm saying is that there is a way to register filters and a way to register additional servlets if that's still something you want to do. It's just via Spring nowadays. So that's the new way. So what's coming in Grails 3.1? So as I showed you in that brief demo of the 3.1 M1, we are refining the REST profile and making it, along with the JSON views and markup views, we're making it a whole better experience compared to Grails 3.0.x. By the way, you can still use that JSON views plugin in Grails 3.0.x, so if you don't want to wait for the 3.1 GA, you can still use that plugin and create your own views. It's not a big deal. We're just providing more code gen and assistance for Grails 3.1. And we're looking at a whole lot of areas to make the REST experience a whole lot better in Grails 3.1, from looking at ways to unify our various marshalling and rendering APIs into a more unified whole, refactoring to around internal APIs around JSON, streaming JSON builder and JSON slurper and the Groovy APIs, which are really maturing nicely in the JSON space. And essentially potentially integrating with documentation engines like Swagger and so forth to improve how your APIs can be documented. So that's another thing we're looking at. And integrating better with HAL, and the HAL Explorer, and making that part of the framework better. So yeah, a complete review of how REST works in Grails and improving that whole area dramatically. Then we're upgrading to MongoDB 3 and Hibernate 5. Any MongoDB users in here? A few, yeah. So MongoDB 3 introduced the notion of codecs, the new driver. So when I say MongoDB 3, I'm referring to the MongoDB 3 Java driver. So they now have an API for codecs. So what that means is, in previous versions in the current version of the MongoDB plugin, what we do is we take your GORM objects and we convert them into a document, and then that document is then saved to MongoDB. That's what happens. So you got this conversion from MongoDB to object to actually writing it to the database. With MongoDB 3 driver and codecs, what happens is we've written and this is already working in the master branch of GORM for MongoDB, is that we convert your GORM domain objects directly, streaming it to the JSON writer using the codec engine in the driver. So there's no conversion from GORM object to document to database. It's direct from GORM object to database. Yeah, this increases the performance of GOM for MongoDB to be pretty much, I've been benchmarking, and if you disable auto-wiring, because GOM objects are auto-wired by default, if you disable auto-wiring, which removes the Spring auto-wiring feature, which not everybody needs, the performance of GOM for MongoDB in reads and write situations in master branch right now using the new codec feature is pretty much on par with the slightly slower than the native driver, like 5%. So it's dramatically faster, GOM for MongoDB in Grails 3.1, which will be out as part of Grails 3.1. And then we'll work on Hibernate 5 support. So to bring GOM for Hibernate up to Hibernate 5 and allow access to all the Hibernate 5 features. And then part of Grails 3.1 is a profile for developing AngularJS applications. We're going to start with AngularJS. So there'll be a profile which will be based on top of our web API profile, on top of our web API profile. For the creation of AngularJS applications. So you'll have your JSON API served by Grails and AngularJS backing on to the application in a complete development experience for developing AngularJS applications. We imagine that some patterns will emerge around that, which will allow us to more easily create profiles for other SPA frameworks, such as Ember and React and React.js and various other SPA frameworks. But we're going to start with Angular and see how that goes from there. And we anticipate the community will also innovate around that area as well. And of course, as I mentioned, the more flexible profile support so that you can have your own profile repositories, local profiles, organization profile repositories, and so on and so forth. So pretty excited about that area too. Grails keeps getting better, and 3.1 is scheduled to ship in Q4 2015, so we're pretty excited by that. And the SPA, the REST profiles, and then so yeah, Q4 at the end of the year, 3.1 will be out. We're starting to iterate very quickly on releasing milestones. So you'll be seeing milestones being released every couple of weeks, I imagine, for the next few months as we accelerate towards a final release. So look out for that. And then in terms of next year, where do we see things going? So in 2016, we're pretty excited to start making Grails more reactive. So we're going to build a Netty profile that essentially allows the development of Grails applications which are fully reactive and asynchronous and occupy a lower memory footprint. We're going to look at making this completely cloud native as well, so that the container can be integrate with some of the 12 factors that were mentioned yesterday in terms of circuit breaker and config server and all the cloud native features of modern application architectures. And we believe that in order to, the way the industry is going, you need to take a fundamental look at future application architectures. Because current application architectures are still based on technology that is now more than a decade old. And we think that the space is ripe for innovation in this area, and excited to see what we can do in 2016 in this area. And then GOM async. So as I said, in Grails 3.1, we're introducing MongoDB 3 driver support, but the MongoDB 3 driver, as well as the codec support that I was discussing earlier, also supports asynchronous persistence and non-blocking persistence. So the current version of GOM async allows you to separate your IO-bound interaction into a separate thread and control that thread, but that IO-bound operations are still blocking. Yeah. So when you do gorm.async.list, for example, you can control that thread pool where your blocking operations are in a separate thread pool, and you can manage that thread pool separately. That's what Grails' current async support is about. But fundamentally, current JDBC specifications and drivers are all blocking. Yeah. So we're looking at as well implementing a completely ground-up, lightweight SQL implementation using non-blocking Postgres and MySQL, and backing Gorm onto that to make a non-blocking version of Gorm. So these are the data stores we're targeting initially, but we imagine some common APIs will emerge, and we believe that in future, as database drivers for the other NoSQL stores out there become more reactive and non-blocking, that we will be able to support additional data stores over on top of this. But I think this is already a pretty comprehensive plan for 2016. So, and we're pretty excited about it. Very excited about it, in fact. So that just leaves time for Q&A. Any questions? Yeah, at the front here.
So I was wondering if you can talk about the state of the migration of the plugins from 2 to 3. So for example, we have a couple in-flight 2.5 projects where we really, one of them we really needed like the searchable plugin, the RabbitMQ native plugin, and because we really needed searchable, we even had to drop back from Hibernate 4 to 3.
Yeah.
So, and I think the plugins is what's really kind of holding us back from Grails 3 a bit. I was wondering if you could comment on it.
So the question is essentially, what is the status of the plugin migration from Grails 2 to Grails 3? So there's two things here. First of all, there's like over 1,000 plugins for Grails 2, and a large portion of those are either not relevant or have been replaced by Gradle plugins from a build perspective. However, there are a significant subset of those plugins that are high value, and we have produced a list of those plugins which is on the wiki. We're happy for the community to contribute to that. And we've been working on assisting the community and also participating in upgrading those plugins to Grails 3. So a lot of that has already happened. A lot of the high value plugins have already been upgraded or already have milestone releases. In the case, you mentioned searchable. In this case, we don't think we are going to upgrade searchable. The reason is because it's based on Compass. Compass is a technology that has been abandoned years ago, and the creators of that technology went off and formed a company called Elasticsearch. And Elasticsearch is the successor to Compass, and they've essentially deprecated that project. So we see more value in developing a new Elasticsearch plugin or porting the existing Elasticsearch plugin and recommending folks use that, because that's where the future development of search is happening. Because Compass, which searchable is based on, is essentially going nowhere. So there are lots of cases like that where certain plugins will not be upgraded because it just doesn't make sense to upgrade them. We don't want to be encouraging users to be using the wrong things. I understand that if you have an existing project that relies on that, that is a challenge, but I think that we can help the community make the move to better technologies as well as part of this process. And we're perfectly aware it's going to take a while. That's why we have a plan to continue to maintain the 2.x branch and encourage folks to move to Grails 3 slowly. And it is happening, but we're in acknowledgement it's going to take time.
Thank you.
Yes, question?
We're in the same spot, and one of the plugins we rely on heavily is Webflow. Do you still relevant?
Okay, so the question is, one of the plugins that we rely heavily on is Webflow, and is it still relevant? So Webflow is a plugin we're looking at upgrading long term. It's on the list. It is definitely a certain plugin that's still has its use cases where you want to maintain server-side state. Although, in terms of a flow, like the shopping cart flow that you want to maintain on the server. Having said that, again, modern applications are more and more moving towards not having that state on the server and instead having it on the client. However, not every project, it depends on the requirements, are allowed to store that kind of state on the client. So we understand that Webflow has a niche that is a lot of folks still want filled. That's why it's on the list of to be upgraded. However, we at OCI, we're looking to work with companies that are interested in undertaking projects like that with us, because again, there's a large amount of plugins, and we want to work together with people to do that, to make that happen. But we want to do it the right way as well, to make sure that that plugin actually makes sense in the Grail 3 world. Yeah.
One of the use cases for Grails plugins in Grails 2.x was to share domain objects among multiple Grails projects. Is a Gradle multi-project build set up to replace that sort of functionality and that sort of use case?
So the question is a Gradle multi-project build set up to replace like inline plugins or modularizing your application with plugins? Absolutely. You can have a Gradle multi-project build that consists of multiple Grails plugins and an application. And you can build those all together, and the Grails plugin can, so that story hasn't gone away. That story is still very much prevalent. You can create a plugin that defines your domain model, and it can be one of the dependencies in your Gradle multi-project build. So absolutely, and it's a way to modularize your application for sure.
No, you talked about integration tests being replaced by JEB functional tests, and does it make sense for REST APIs? Looks like JEB is I think it's testing for web pages, right?
Yeah, so that is one of, again, we're working on improving the REST profile across milestones, the web API profile. The web profile, yeah, JEB makes complete sense for testing HTML, JavaScript responses. But for web API projects with JSON responses, it makes less sense. So we plan to add a functional testing template that instead uses REST builder or something more appropriate for consuming and parsing and testing JSON. Yeah, so REST Builder, for example, is absolutely. Yeah, so something like REST Builder will allow you to functional test the backend web API applications, and we're looking at integrating something like that into the web API profile. This is just milestone 1. We have a lot more work to do to make it more refined.
Some of the same attention of being also upgraded? And the other question is GGTS. Are you shutting the door on that? I mean, I know that you can get the Gradle plugin, but as an IDE that really fully support and was customized.
Yeah. So the question is 2 questions really. One is relating to is Groovy getting the same attention. The other one is GGTS getting attention. So let's start with Groovy. First of all, we are completely aware that long-term that Groovy is something that we want to invest in. However, in the short term, Groovy is actually in a pretty good place because historically it's always had significant community contribution. And now with the move to Apache, that's even more the case. It has a very strong community of external and external contributors, and it's continuing to move forward, and that's been really encouraging to see. At the same time, with languages, a bit of stability is actually quite a good thing. So Groovy is quite mature now, and it went through a period of rapid change, and actually a period of stability and building a base, and is actually a good thing. So it doesn't have a desperate need at this stage. I think that will change when things like Java 9 get closer. And we need to extend Groovy to support things like Jigsaw and modules and those kind of things. But I don't have any immediate concerns about Groovy at this stage. I think it's doing fantastically well in Apache. In terms of GGTS, it's not something that we have abandoned or anything like that. The GGTS team are working, the GGTS team are still at Pivotal, and they are part of the STS team. They have open sourced all of GGTS and Groovy Eclipse. Now, we encourage folks to have a look at IntelliJ because that is advancing much faster, and the community edition is free. So the community edition of IntelliJ is free, and in IntelliJ 15, which is out at the end of the year, they will have full Grails 3 support. And if you look at the state of Eclipse as well, forgetting about GGTS, for example, IBM no longer employ Eclipse committers, pretty much as far as I'm aware. The whole ecosystem has slowed down dramatically, and in a period where investment in technology and IDEs and tools is critical, that's why you get companies like Google moving to IntelliJ for Android tooling, because Eclipse is essentially stagnant right now. And that's not a good thing as an ecosystem. So we would like to see it move forward. We just haven't come towards a concrete strategy on how to make that happen. We also have overall concerns about the Eclipse ecosystem in general right now, and how that's going to move forward without IBM's support, which is concerning at this point in time. Maybe that'll change. And if it does, we hope it does, because I think it's good to have two different vendors with outputting quality IDs. But yeah, we're keeping an eye on that situation, and we would love to talk to companies that would be interested in investing in Eclipse tooling as well. So if you know anybody, send them our way. Yeah, in the back there.
What can tell you us about the security in Grails in the context of these many profiles?
So the question is, do I have anything to say regarding security?
Yes.
Yes, so we have a Spring Security 3 M1 release out already for Grails 3. So if you use the Spring Security core plugin from Grails 2, that's now available in Grails 3. You can also use the Spring Security starter POMs for Spring Boot. So if you prefer to customize how Spring Security is configured explicitly, then you can use the same APIs in Spring Boot. Remember, I showed you have an application class, so you can configure Spring Security directly with Spring Boot. So you have the flexibility of configuring it by hand in Spring Boot if you want, and going right into the nitty-gritty detail. But we also have a Spring Security core plugin available. So I think we have a good security story already for Grails 3, but we're going to see that improving as the remaining Spring Security star ecosystem is migrated. And I think there's already four Spring Security plugins that have been migrated, and that's going to accelerate over time. Any other questions?
Can I just quickly?
Maybe last one? Yeah.
On the Spring Security, we've never written an application that doesn't use it. And,
Yeah.
we are developing much more RESTful applications itself. Is there any, with the future REST work, is there any integration between the two with strictly REST APIs?
Yeah, so that's another area we're looking at for the web API profile is how we can integrate things like OAuth and so on to make the out-of-the-box experience with security a lot better for REST applications. So again, there's a Spring Security REST plugin that's that needs to be migrated, and probably we may even consider doing that as part of our Grails 3.1 work.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much.